So many stories in those brown eyes, looking at the moon, sitting on earth, hoping it will bloom. All the stories in those brown eyes, hope we hear them soon.
Now, some of y'all may remember back in the day, some of the older folks in the room will remember back when Sunday football, NFL football, used to only be on CBS. This is before Fox had a license to show games, and it was just CBS, right? And there were usually 2 games a day. Now, I live in the Central Time Zone, so in the Central Time Zone, I don't know about out here, but it was 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock. And the 3 o'clock game, if you were on the East Coast or in the Central Time Zone, would always bleed over into the 6 o'clock hour, which is when 60 Minutes comes on, right? And so what would happen, now if you're on the West Coast, they would show it in real time, because y'all were behind a couple hours, and so you could see it live. It didn't interrupt 60 Minutes. But if you were on the East Coast or in Central Time, it would bleed over, and about 6:15, the game would end, right? And the announcer would come in, and the voiceover would say, "And now back to your regularly scheduled programming." Right? That's sort of what the election of Donald Trump is, y'all, just so you know. It is back to your regularly scheduled programming. It's not something new. It's not a break with tradition. Folks that are tripping on the election of Donald Trump who act like somehow this is a deviation from America's norm, that this is somehow some unique, horrible break with the history of the country. No. The glitch was the 8 years of the Obama administration. This is back to your regularly scheduled programming. The history of politicians scapegoating black and brown folks, blaming them for problems that they didn't create, and then getting votes on the basis of that, that's not new. Donald Trump didn't create that, didn't invent that. That's been going on for 400 years, back to the colonial period, before we even were a country. So the first lesson is, don't assume that what's happened all of a sudden is a new thing. Don't be shocked by it. This is normal for America. Welcome to your country, right? Is what this really is all about. We have to start with that, and we have to understand the past and how the past connects to the present, so that we can understand this isn't a unique break with history. And the reason it's important, it's not just an academic point. If you want to fight injustice, you have to know the injustice that you're up against. And if you think that it's a new thing, if you think the monster in the room is new and unique, it becomes disempowering because you don't know how to fight that monster. If you understand that we've seen this monster before, that we've seen this movie before, that there's really nothing new about this, then you can take lessons from our history about how to resist and figure out how to do that again, you see? So we don't want to build up the monster into something bigger than it is. We don't want to underestimate it, but we also don't want to give it more power than it deserves. We have to dissect it, and we have to understand its continuity, not its unique rupture with the history of this country. So let's talk about that.
Centuries of systemic racism have created a wealth gap in America between black and white Americans. In her latest New York Times piece, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Nikole Hannah-Jones writes, if true justice and equality are ever to be achieved in the United States, the country must finally take seriously what it owes black Americans. MSNBC correspondent Tremaine Lee interviewed Nikole Hannah-Jones in his latest Into America podcast on reparations. Tremaine joins me now. And Tremaine, what are the factors that Nikole talked about here that are contributing or have contributed to the racial wealth gap in our country?
Hey, Allison, more than just contributions, the actual source, the root of the wealth gap goes back to shortly after emancipation, when the entire, enslaved population, formerly enslaved population, really were pushed out with absolutely nothing, starting from ground zero. And even though the government had promised some restitution in 40 acres and a mule, those promises fell through. And in fact, the former, plantation owners were given back that land that had been promised to enslaved people.
So how do we begin to close the gap between black and white Americans, and what would closing that gap mean for black Americans, their future, their economic security?
Well, part of the issue has always been that black folks haven't been able to accumulate the wealth and then pass it on, like buying a house and then passing it on to your children, or taking the equity out of that and passing it on. And so Nikole Hannah-Jones argues that there is only one solution, and that's restitution or reparations. Let's take a listen to what she has to say.
Imagine this. Tomorrow morning, the United States announces that every black American is entitled to $151 million in reparations. Not just a symbolic gesture, but actual life-changing wealth, deposited directly into the hands of those whose ancestors built this country for free. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, by the end of this video, you'll not only understand why this is entirely possible, but also why every black American should never pay taxes again. Yes, you heard that right. Never pay taxes again. Because the numbers, the history, and the moral argument are all on our side. Let's start with a simple yet powerful question. What if reparations were the key to solving the racial wealth gap once and for all? Right now, the median wealth of a white family in America is nearly 8 times higher than that of a black family. 8 times. That's not a gap, that's a canyon. And this disparity didn't happen by accident. It's the result of centuries of systemic exploitation, starting with slavery and continuing through Jim Crow laws, redlining, and discriminatory practices that persist to this day. But what if we could change that narrative? What if we could give every black American the financial freedom they deserve? Here's the shocking truth. Reparations aren't just a moral obligation, they're a financial necessity. The total economic value of the labor stolen during slavery is estimated to be around $6.2 trillion in today's dollars. That's not even accounting for the generational wealth that was stolen through segregation, discriminatory lending practices, and economic disenfranchisement. Reparations could close the racial wealth gap overnight, but more importantly, they would finally begin to address the economic harm inflicted on black Americans for generations. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Think about it. If the government owes you $151 million, how could they possibly justify taxing you on top of that? The numbers don't lie, and the math is simple. What black Americans are owed far exceeds any amount they've paid in taxes or will ever pay in their lifetimes. Let's talk about why this issue is so urgent. Did you know that during the Jim Crow era, black Americans were deliberately excluded from programs like the GI Bill, which helped millions of white families buy homes, start businesses, and build generational wealth? Or that black farmers lost an estimated 90% of their land due to discriminatory lending and outright theft? These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a calculated system designed to keep black Americans economically disadvantaged. Here's a quick example. Redlining, the practice of denying loans to black families based on where they lived, didn't just block access to homeownership, it robbed entire communities of the opportunity to build wealth. And the effects are still felt today. Black families are far less likely to own homes, which means they miss out on one of the most significant sources of generational wealth in America. And yet, despite all of this, black Americans have contributed billions in taxes, funding a system that has historically worked against them. This is why reparations aren't just about writing a check, they're about justice. They're about finally acknowledging that the economic inequality we see today is a direct result of policies that were designed to oppress. And they're about leveling the playing field so that every black American has the opportunity to thrive. Imagine the possibilities. $151 million in reparations could mean financial freedom for millions of families. It could mean homeownership, education, entrepreneurship, and the ability to invest in future generations. And yes, it could mean no longer paying taxes to a system that has failed to deliver on its promises of equality and opportunity. If the US government can find trillions of dollars to fund wars, bail out corporations, and give tax cuts to billionaires, why can't it find the money to repay the debt it owes to black Americans? And more importantly, how can we make sure that this conversation doesn't just stay hypothetical, but becomes a reality? The case for reparations isn't just about righting historical wrongs. It's about addressing a financial imbalance that black Americans have been forced to carry for generations. But here's the twist. Reparations don't just level the playing field. They make the case that black Americans should be exempt from taxes altogether. Let's talk about the tax burden that black Americans shoulder. Right now, black households contribute billions of dollars annually to federal, state, and local taxes. According to recent studies, black taxpayers contribute 13.8% of all federal income taxes, despite earning far less than their white counterparts. Think about that for a moment. A population that has been historically excluded from wealth-building opportunities is disproportionately funding a system that has worked against them for centuries. Now, let's look at this through the lens of reparations. If each black American were entitled to $151 million in reparations, the government would effectively owe them far more than or will ever pay in taxes. The numbers make it clear. Black Americans are not just taxpayers, they're creditors. And the debt owed to them isn't hypothetical. It's real, quantifiable, and long overdue. But the argument goes deeper than just the numbers. Taxes are supposed to fund services and systems that benefit the people who pay them. For centuries, however, black Americans have been taxed to fund systems that actively excluded or oppressed them. Let's take a historical example. During the Jim Crow era, black Americans were required to pay taxes just like everyone else. yet they were denied access to the very schools, hospitals, and public services their taxes funded. In fact, much of the infrastructure in the South was built with tax dollars from black citizens who were barred from using those same facilities. This isn't just inequality, it's theft. And it didn't end with Jim Crow. Even today, black Americans face systemic barriers that diminish the value of their tax contributions. Consider property taxes, which fund public schools. Because of redlining and segregation, black families are more likely to live in areas with lower property values, resulting in underfunded schools. This creates a cycle where black children are systematically denied the same educational opportunities as their white peers, despite their families paying the same or higher tax rates in some cases. Then there's the issue of criminal justice. Black Americans are disproportionately taxed to fund police departments, courts, and prisons, all while being over-policed, over-prosecuted, and over-incarcerated. For example, in Ferguson, Missouri, over 20% of the city's budget came from fines and court fees, disproportionately levied on black residents. Essentially, black Americans are paying for a system that criminalizes their very existence. If the government acknowledges its debt to black Americans, debt that stems from centuries of exploitation, exclusion, and systemic racism, how can it continue to justify taxing them? If America can afford to give massive tax cuts to billionaires and corporations, why can't it afford to stop taxing black Americans who are owed reparations? The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act alone cost the U.S. government $1.5 trillion in lost revenue, most of which benefited the wealthiest Americans. Compare that to the estimated $10 to $12 trillion cost of reparations. The math is simple, the resources exist, they're just a matter of priorities. Finally, let's talk about fairness. Some might argue that exempting black Americans from taxes is unfair to other groups. But let's be clear, fairness isn't about treating everyone the same, it's about addressing the inequities that have been baked into the system. Reparations and tax exemptions are not special treatment, they're overdue justice. So here's the bottom line. Black Americans have been forced to pay into a system that has exploited and excluded them for centuries. Reparations are not just a way to balance the scales, they're a way to acknowledge the truth and begin to repair the damage. And until that debt is paid in full, asking black Americans to pay taxes is nothing short of adding insult to injury. The numbers don't lie. The history doesn't lie. Reparations aren't just necessary, they're a moral and financial imperative. And if the government is serious about justice, it must recognize that black Americans shouldn't be footing the bill for a system that still owes them so much. To truly understand why reparations are not only justified but essential, we need to revisit one of the most damaging periods in American history, the Jim Crow era. This was a time when laws weren't just racist in their intent, they were economic weapons designed to keep black Americans in a permanent state of poverty. These laws didn't just strip away opportunities, they actively stole wealth from black communities, and their impact is still felt today. During the Jim Crow era, black Americans were systematically denied access to the basic building blocks of economic success. Take land ownership, for example. Land is one of the most reliable ways to build generational wealth, but for black Americans, owning land was often a near impossible dream. By the early 20th century, black farmers owned over 16 million acres of land. But through a combination of discriminatory lending practices, legal loopholes, and outright violence, black land ownership dwindled to less than 2 million acres by the end of the century. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a coordinated effort to strip black Americans of their wealth. Then there was housing. The Federal Housing Administration, established in the 1930s, was supposed to make homeownership accessible to more Americans. But through a process known as redlining, the FHA refused to insure mortgages in predominantly black neighborhoods. This meant that black families couldn't access the low-interest loans that allowed millions of white families to buy homes and build wealth. Even worse, black families who managed to buy homes often saw their property values deliberately devalued because of the color of their skin. Over decades, this cost black families an estimated $156 billion in lost equity, money that should have been passed down to future generations. Education was another area where Jim Crow laws inflicted lasting economic harm. Black schools were chronically underfunded, receiving only a fraction of the resources allocated to white schools. This wasn't just a matter of neglect, it was a deliberate strategy to deny black children the education they needed to compete in the workforce. Even when black families paid taxes to support public education, those dollars were funneled into schools that excluded their children. The result? Generations of Black Americans were locked out of higher-paying jobs and career opportunities. But the economic oppression didn't stop with education. After World War II, programs like the GI Bill helped millions of veterans buy homes, start businesses, and attend college. But Black veterans were largely excluded from these benefits. Southern officials ensured that Black soldiers returning from war were denied access to the programs they had fought to earn. This robbed Black families of the chance to use these benefits to build wealth, while white families used them to catapult into the middle class. Even Black entrepreneurs faced systemic barriers. Many cities had laws that restricted Black-owned businesses from operating in certain areas, effectively cutting them off from lucrative markets. In cases where Black businesses thrived despite these obstacles, they were often targeted for destruction. One of the most infamous examples is the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where a thriving Black community known as Black Wall Street was destroyed by a white mob. In a single night, hundreds of lives were lost, and an estimated $200 million in today's dollars was wiped out. And let's not forget the role of the criminal justice system. During the Jim Crow era, Black Americans were disproportionately arrested and convicted for minor or fabricated offenses, then sentenced to hard labor in prison camps. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about profit. The convict leasing system allowed states to lease incarcerated Black men to private companies, essentially continuing the practice of slavery under a different name. This forced labor not only denied Black men their freedom, but also deprived their families of breadwinners and economic stability. These injustices weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic effort to maintain white supremacy by keeping Black Americans economically disadvantaged. And while the Jim Crow era officially ended with the civil rights movement, its legacy lives on. Today, Black Americans still face significant barriers to wealth building, from discriminatory lending practices to wage gaps and employment discrimination. The racial wealth gap we see today isn't a fluke, it's the direct result of policies designed to create and maintain inequality. Now, let's talk about the modern-day parallels. While Jim Crow laws are no longer on the books, their impact is still evident in the policies and practices that continue to disadvantage Black Americans. For example, predatory lending disproportionately targets Black borrowers, charging them higher interest rates and fees than their white counterparts, even when they have similar credit profiles. This has resulted in Black families losing billions of dollars in wealth through foreclosures and excessive interest payments. Wage inequality is another area where the legacy of Jim Crow persists. On average, Black workers earn about 75 cents for every dollar earned by white workers, and the gap is even wider for Black women. This disparity isn't just about individual paychecks, it's about a lifetime of lost earnings, reduced retirement savings, and diminished opportunities for future generations. Even in the realm of taxation, the disparities are glaring. Black Americans are more likely to face audits and penalties from the IRS, despite earning less than white taxpayers. In some states, Black homeowners pay higher property taxes than white homeowners in similar neighborhoods. This means that Black families are not only earning less, but also paying more into a system that continues to work against them. So, what does all this mean for reparations? It means that the debt owed to Black Americans isn't just about slavery, it's about the cumulative impact of centuries of systemic oppression, from Jim Crow to modern-day discrimination. Reparations aren't just about making up for the past, they're about addressing the present. They're about acknowledging that the economic harm inflicted on Black Americans didn't end with slavery, it evolved, and it's still happening today. This is why reparations must be comprehensive. They can't just be a one-time payment. They must include structural changes to address the systemic inequalities that persist. And they must recognize that the economic debt owed to Black Americans far outweighs any taxes they've ever paid. Until this debt is paid in full, asking Black Americans to contribute to a system that has historically excluded them isn't just unjust, it's immoral. The bottom line is this: the legacy of Jim Crow isn't just history, it's an ongoing reality. Reparations are about more than money, they're about justice. They're about repairing the harm that's been done and creating a future where Black Americans can finally build the wealth and opportunities they've been denied for far too long. It's time for America to face this truth and take action. The conversation about reparations isn't just about acknowledging the past, it's about taking bold steps to correct centuries of systemic injustice. But beyond the moral argument lies a practical one. Reparations aren't just the right thing to do, they're the smart thing to do. By addressing the racial wealth gap, America has the chance to not only repair its past, but also build a stronger, more equitable future. Let's unpack the case for reparations and why they must come with a tax exemption for Black Americans. First, the moral argument is undeniable. For centuries, Black Americans have been exploited, excluded, and oppressed, yet they've continued to contribute to the economic growth of this country. From unpaid labor during slavery to paying taxes into systems that excluded them, Black Americans have given far more to this nation than they've received in return. Reparations aren't charity, they're justice. They acknowledge that the wealth and power of the United States were built, in large part, on the backs of enslaved Africans and their descendants. But morality alone isn't enough to create change, so let's talk about the economic argument. Reparations, if done correctly, would inject trillions of dollars into the economy, benefiting not just Black Americans but the nation as a whole. Imagine millions of Black families suddenly having the resources to buy homes, start businesses, and invest in education. The ripple effects would be transformative. Studies show that reducing the racial wealth gap would significantly boost the GDP, create jobs, and stimulate economic growth. In short, reparations aren't just good for Black Americans, they're good for America. Now, let's address the elephant in the room: taxes. If the government recognizes that it owes Black Americans $151 million each in reparations, how can it justify continuing to tax them? The logic is clear. Until the debt is paid in full, Black Americans shouldn't have to contribute to a system that has historically worked against them. This isn't just about fairness, it's about accountability. By exempting Black Americans from taxes, the government acknowledges that the financial contributions of Black citizens have already exceeded their fair share. It's a tangible way to begin repairing the economic harm caused by centuries of systemic racism. Think about what this would mean for Black families. The average American pays about 30% of their income in taxes. For Black Americans, eliminating that tax burden would free up billions of dollars annually. That money could be reinvested into Black-owned businesses, used to pay off debt, or saved for future generations. In essence, a tax exemption isn't just about financial relief, it's about empowerment. It's about giving Black Americans the resources to build wealth on their own terms. And let's not forget the historical context. For centuries, Black Americans have been forced to pay into systems that excluded or actively harmed them. During the Jim Crow era, Black taxpayers funded schools, hospitals, and public infrastructure that they were barred from using. Even today, Black communities are disproportionately taxed through practices like predatory fines and fees, all while receiving fewer resources in return. A tax exemption acknowledges this history and begins to level the playing field. But beyond the economic and moral arguments lies a bigger question: what kind of country do we want to be? Reparations and tax exemptions aren't just about righting past wrongs. They're about building a future where justice and equality are more than just ideals. They're about creating a society where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of their race or background. And they're about showing the world that America is willing to confront its past to create a better future. Here's the bottom line: reparations are about more than money. They're about acknowledging the truth, repairing the harm, and creating a future where Black Americans can finally thrive. And a tax exemption isn't just a financial benefit, it's a statement. It says, we see the harm that's been done, and we're committed to making it right. It's a matter of national integrity. Logic doesn't hold. If you owe someone money, you don't turn around and demand that they pay you more. Instead, you settle the debt. Exempting Black Americans from taxes until reparations are paid isn't just a financial argument, it's a moral one. It acknowledges that the contributions of Black Americans to this country have already far exceeded their fair share. From the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans that built America's wealth, to the taxes they've paid into systems that excluded them, Black Americans have more than earned their right to tax relief. And let's not forget the broader economic impact. Eliminating the tax burden for Black Americans, even temporarily, would free up billions of dollars annually that could be reinvested into Black communities. In essence, it's not just about giving back what's owed, it's about creating a foundation for future growth and prosperity. What if African Americans had been given the land and resources they deserved? How different would America look today?
So we have to understand the past in order to understand what's going on now. It's not just with the presidency, though. It's with the inequalities that you see when you look around. Like, for instance, if you don't understand the history of law enforcement misconduct in Black space in black communities, Black Lives Matter won't make any sense to you. Now, I want to be very clear when I talk about the history of law enforcement misconduct. I'm not talking about every damn cop. I'm not talking about good cops and bad cops, good people and bad people. I'm talking about a history and a culture of law enforcement that has simply not treated black and brown peoples the same as white folks. And anyone who denies that what I just said is true has not studied history and is not competent to speak about it, right? Because the history of policing traces directly back to slave patrols. That was the first iteration of law enforcement on this land in any real formal sense. It was police, after all, who enforced the slave codes. It was police who enforced segregation after slavery was ended. It was police who conspired to engage in lynchings of thousands of black bodies, releasing suspected criminals or people who weren't even suspected of a crime into the hands of the mob. It was police that pulled protesters off of sit-in stools in the 1960s. It was police that turned water cannons and dogs on children in the streets of Birmingham. It was police that did the same and beat protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. It was cops, along with uniformed military personnel, that rampaged in Mexican-American communities in Los Angeles during the Zoot Suit riots in 1943. That was law enforcement. It wasn't just average people. It was people whose job was to, quote unquote, enforce the law. The problem is, if you live in a society where the laws are unjust, everyone who enforces those laws is engaged in injustice by definition, you see? It's not about good people and bad people. It's about if a system is flawed, the people who enforce that system are culpable. And people of color know that.